Hello guys. Before we jump into the Kubernetes demo, let us try to understand what is Kubernetes, high level architecture of the Kubernetes, and what are the different components of the Kubernetes. So why should we use Kubernetes? So main advantage of the using Kubernetes is a open source system for managing K8S objects creation. For example, pods, resources, volumes creation, all those things can be done with help of the Kubernetes. Kubernetes also provides a vendor neutral implementation for health check of the pods, auto scaling of the pods, load balancing between different objects. All those things are provided with the help of the manifest file. Manifest files are the primary way for defining the objects in the Kubernetes. Those are the YAML files. In the YAML files, we define how to create the different type of objects like deployment objects or service objects or persistent volume objects or some other objects. All those objects can be created with the help of Kubernetes manifest file. With this, it is also important to understand that what Kubernetes does not do for us and what is not a Kubernetes. So first thing is Kubernetes is not a service provider like a Amazon services. Also, it is not in itself a service. Many times we think that EKS is a Kubernetes, but EKS uses the Kubernetes to provide the managed service. Internally, it uses all the required detail that needs to create the Kubernetes cluster. Also, Kubernetes is not an alternative to the Docker. In fact, Kubernetes uses the Docker to orchestrate the container. What I mean is, when you are starting the pod, we use images, and those images are Docker images. Those images are pulled from the Docker registry. For example, Docker Hub. Therefore, Kubernetes is not alternative to Docker. Let us try to understand high level overview of the Kubernetes architecture. In a Kubernetes cluster, mainly there are two components that defines the Kubernetes. One of them is a master node and another is a worker node. In a Kubernetes cluster, there is only one master node and there can be multiple worker nodes. So all the worker nodes gets registered with the master node, and whenever we are deploying any objects of the Kubernetes using the manifest file, these objects are placed into the worker node. So master node is a service and this service is deployed in a separate machine from the worker node. It is responsible for interacting and managing the worker node. So all the worker node that we create gets registered with the master node, and it controls all the pods distribution across worker nodes. So when we are deploying work any pod on the worker node, we cannot decide that in which worker node this particular pod will be going. It will be managed by master node. Then we have got a worker node, and worker node is something like we can consider is a virtual machine, or in a AWS world we can say it is a EC2 instance. So these EC2 instance, when we make it as a worker node, it has to be registered with a master node, and worker node is managed by the master node. So all the worker nodes that we create has to be registered with a master node. So what are the objects we can create on the worker nodes? The worker node has to have some basic things like Docker. It also needs the Kubernetes, and kube proxy. These are the services or APIs that worker node uses to interact with the master nodes. And then, of course, as we discuss, Kubernetes, when we are deploying any kind of the Kubernetes objects, these objects will go into the worker node like pods or persistent volume or persistent volume claims or services. All those things can be deployed on the worker node. Then another very important objects of the Kubernetes is a pod. So pod is the smallest unit in the Kubernetes world. It is like a Docker container. So when we are creating a pod, we can add one or more container inside the pod. Generally, one pod contains the one containers, but we can add multiple container as well. Also, pod can hold the resources like volumes, and also we can many times what when we are creating a pod, it doesn't get created individually, but we wrap a pod inside the deployment object. So the deployment object will manage the life cycle of the pod. For some reason, if the pod is shut down due to some kind of memory issue or something, then what deployment object will do is it will restart the pod. Also, depending on the deployment object manifest file, it will execute the things that are defined inside the deployment object for pod. For example, where to be fetch images for the pod or how many replicas of the pod to be created. All those things will be managed with help of deployment object. So Kubernetes have many different components. Some of them are listed here, and we also have learn about some of the objects like master node, worker node, clusters, and pods, and containers. All those things, and many of the concepts we will be learning throughout the course. So this is the high level overview of the Kubernetes. And in a coming lectures, we will be discussing how all the things, all the components are interlinked and how it works. Thank you very much for watching this video.